Hello and welcome to Beyond the Paradigm. My guest today is Walter Bosley. Walter is a former FBI agent, and in this episode today, he recounts a story of something that happened to him back in the 1980s at Disney World. It is a fascinating story, and if you enjoy topics like this, first of all, please could I ask you to like the episode, and secondly, please subscribe to the channel. Well, for the first time on Beyond the Paradigm, Walter Bosley, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to talking about stuff with you.
Yeah, really looking forward to this. So, as it's your first time on the show, and I like to do this with all first time guests, could you just tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to be doing the research and the things you're doing now?
Sure. Many years ago, when I was a young guy out of college, I had an uncle who was becoming kind of a mentor to me. And he suggested, hey, kid, you might find it interesting, um, doing James Bondy type of work, we could say. And that intrigued me. So I ended up working in the U.S. national security community for 20 years in multiple organizations. Started with the FBI, then went to the Air Force, earned my commission, and went right into Agent Academy for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI. And I did my entire time on active duty as an OSI agent uh, in counterintelligence and counterespionage. In fact, I was chief of the counterespionage operations branch at Wright-Patterson, the legendary Wright-Patterson,
Mhm.
for a few years. And then I left the Air Force and went to work for some other guys in counterterrorism, working around the world, just you name it, all over the place in both war zones, Iraq and Afghanistan included. And pretty much rounded out my 20 years for a couple of years as a security background investigator. People in the U.S. that are going to get security clearances, right, for their work. I would do their background investigations, to make sure that they didn't have any problems in that. So during that time, those last few years of my career, I also established a little small press publishing company, like a micro press. And I just passed my 22 years in business mark with the publishing company. And that's what I focused on mainly since leaving work for Uncle Sam, has been pursuing the publishing, writing a lot of books, doing a lot of research, and working on media projects and stuff. So that's pretty much, me for the last, my gosh, what, more than 30 years now, almost 40 years actually.
Yeah, I actually was in Afghanistan. I served in British forces. Did you ever go to Torchlight at Camp Bastion?
Did I ever what?
Go to Torchlight at Camp Bastion?
No, no,
You
I was in,
didn't. Okay.
yeah, I was in uh, locations in Mosul,
Right.
Basra, worked out of Nasiriyah, just kind of
Yeah.
different little places, small units. We would be in Iraq. I would be co-located with our special forces units, and Afghanistan. I worked out of the Hotel Ariana.
So I'm actually so the clearances you would have been doing is I got uh clearance to counter-terrorism level over here in the UK because I used to work in a category A prison, which is like the same as what you have maximum security over there in the United States.
Right.
So I know about these sort of background checks, and there's like sort of
Yeah.
different levels, isn't there? So that's what you would have been doing. And like the highest level we have over here is the CTC, which is counter-terrorism, which I've got that,
Yeah.
which took a long, long time. I'm still covered actually for the next 6 years, but that's because of the people we would have been working with in the prison, because some of them were in for terrorism offences. So we had to be obviously cleared. Now, obviously, he was in the FBI.
Right.
So my understanding of the FBI is only from what I've seen on TV.
Okay.
So because we don't really have, well, I'd say we don't have anything similar. We actually do now.
Oh,
We
you
have the
do.
National Crime Agency.
Okay.
But just for my guests who I have obviously a lot of my guests, probably 65% are US based, but for those who aren't US based,
Mhm.
just give us a brief sort of understanding of what the FBI is, because I know you have different police forces.
Sure. Well, we always, back when I was with the Bureau, we always considered your MI5 as our counterparts, very often over there. The FBI is the federal law enforcement agency that, on the, I don't want to say the smaller level, but fugitives, bank robbers, criminal organizations, uh, white collar crime, that kind of thing, kidnapping, that kind of thing. But actually, even though people would see a lot of that in movies and on TV, the majority of the FBI budget and focus is on national security. And that's essentially, when you do national security stuff in the FBI, it's counter espionage. You're working against foreign intelligence officers that are working in the United States, the domestic United States. Now, of course, FBI agents will work out of the country because they'll work with our counterparts in whatever particular country that is. When a particular spy case, for example, has overlap with what's going on in the domestic US. They, of course, do a lot of counterterrorism now for the last few decades, just because when the world, changed mostly in that direction. But they are really the top law enforcement authority in the domestic United States. Below that, you have your state levels. Each state has its own bureau of investigation and state police. And then you have county and then your city and things like that. There's been a little bit of changes, since I've been out, particularly since the emergence of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, because they've kind of taken some of what used to be primarily exclusively the mission of the FBI. But that's pretty much it.
So what sort of stuff were you investigating? What were you mainly looking into, or was it just a variety?
When I was with the FBI, I was a specialist. I was not an agent. I worked undercover. The my first specialist, a counterintelligence specialist, I worked on a discrete covert physical surveillance team, and we were assigned to known or suspected agents of the KGB and the GRU. This I started back in 1988.
Hmm.
And then after I did that for a while, I got language training, Russian. And for a few years, I basically what we call sat on a wiretap, a FISA wiretap, just sitting at a desk listening to the FISA wiretaps on, in my particular case, what I was assigned to were GRU, which is military intelligence for the old Soviet Union. I worked against GRU agents who were working under commercial trade cover in Manhattan. And that was on kind of a deep undercover squad. My time as a specialist in the FBI, after you finish training, they welcome you back. They say, "Hey, welcome to the squad. Now we don't want to see you anywhere near the federal building because you're supposed to be undercover, right?" And so that's what I did most of my time. I think I worked in my 6 years for the FBI. I worked less than 12 months in an actual FBI office identified as such. So it was mostly spies. It was all spy
Hmm.
stuff that I worked against the Soviets and the Chinese. When I was an agent, then I got commissioned. I'm an officer in the Air Force over here, reserve inactive. I add on to that. But I was a badge carrying federal agent for the U.S. for the OSI, and again, I worked spy cases, but mostly I was chief of what we call counter espionage operations, which double agents, and I'll leave it at that. And that was out of Wright Pat. And so it was anything that would pop up when I was an agent that had to do with national security or espionage. That was what I did. That
Hmm.
was my specialty.
I use the FBI Vault quite a lot. It's quite interesting. I've used it for some of my episodes that I've done. I did one on Jeffrey Epstein and the Finders, and I read through their documents, and there's a lot of information on there. One of the things that stood out to me in that particular case was that I think when they went to his house initially, I think he sexually assaulted a, I want to say, a 14-year-old girl. But initially, when they went to his house, the documents state that he'd clearly been tipped off. This is what the FBI documents say, clearly been tipped off because a lot of the evidence that they suspected they would find had been removed, like the computers missing. It was clear someone had tipped them off, and it's a fantastic resource. I mean, obviously, some of the documents are heavily redacted. People's names generally, unless they're already dead, then they seem to be in there. But we're going to shift gear now because I mean, you've clearly lived a fascinating life because that sounds really fascinating what you've been doing. But I wanted to first of all talk to you about Disneyland in the 1980s because I know you've got a fascinating story. So can you tell us what happened there?
Ah, yes. In a way, I'm still trying to figure it out, right? Um,
Mm.
this is what's interesting about this story and what was happening in my life at that time, because this actually, believe it or not, has its connection to what I just went through in my 20-year career. The man who was my mentor, who really opened doors for me, and who was very much a part of my life during my career. And he himself had spent decades in the U.S. national security community. This same man, an uncle of mine, was also my spiritual mystic advisor guru, if you will. Okay. And these weird things, like I'm going to tell you about what happened at Disneyland, weird things were happening in my life. And I've always found it interesting that I still passed all the US government psych tests, so they clearly didn't think I was crazy. Not that I talked about that stuff, and that stuff didn't have to do with my daily duties, but there is a connection in the background there with the weird stuff. But what happened was I was a senior in high school. This was in, I think, February of 1981. And it was on a Wednesday evening. I'm at Disneyland with some friends. Now, when you live in Southern California, particularly back then before things got crazy and expensive and crowded, going to Disneyland was just something you would up and decide, hey, everybody, let's go to Disneyland today. It was, affordable. It was not crowded, and you would just do it. I mean, I've been there countless times. So back then in 81, um, off I go with some friends. We had the day off from school for some reason. I can't remember. And sometime around 9 o'clock, like 9:30, we're riding the carousel because you ride everything no matter how old you are. I still ride all the kiddie rides. And we're on the carousel, and I see this man in a black suit, white shirt, no tie. I placed him around 70 years old. He had snow white hair and beard. His hair was probably about as short as mine. His beard was about as long as mine. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if there's anything Freudian going on there. But Snow White, about 70 years old, and he's standing there. And for those who may or may not be familiar with the geography of Disneyland, the one in California, you're riding the carousel, and you've got the Dumbo ride kind of to the left, and then you've got what's called Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and in between that you have this pathway that takes you to the Teacup ride and over where the Matterhorn is, and you've all heard of It's a Small World. This man was standing, kind of centered where that path meets the carousel in between those other two. So I'm going around and I see him, and he's just standing there watching the carousel, watching the carousel. And finally I come around and he's not there. And, the ride ends. My friends and I get off the ride, and we start taking that path that I just described back towards the Matterhorn. And as we're approaching, at that time, there was a bench underneath the monorail track, which is the train thing, elevated train ride. And the man is sitting on the bench, and I don't know why. To this day, I just felt compelled to go up and talk to him. And in that conversation, I learned that his name was Alfred, and he had never been to Disneyland, and he was down to
one ticket, in his ticket book. Back then, they still had the ticket books, but they had just started doing the passport ticket, the unlimited use ticket, which is what everybody gets now. But back then, it was a novelty. And that's what we had because we were kids and we wanted to ride, pirates. Oh, wearing a pirate's shirt. That was unintended. We wanted to ride things 100 times or whatever. So we would get that ticket. So the old man his eyes were wide, and you would have thought that he'd been dropped in heaven, the way he was just wide-eyed and looking at everything and just amazed, like he had never seen or heard of such a place as Disneyland. So we end up taking him over to It's a Small World because the ticket he could ride that, and we rode it with him. He sat up in the front of the boat, and we were riding with him, and he's just, we all kind of laugh about Small World, right? Because the song, is an earworm. But he's just in awe of all of this, and we get off the ride and we're walking back, and by this time it's like 10 o'clock ish or whatever. And I don't know what compelled me, but I thought, I come to Disneyland a lot, and we'd been there most of the day. I gave the guy my passport ticket, and we had a pin because we used to pin them on our shirts. And so I pinned it on the lapel of his coat. You would have thought that I had given him a pot of gold. His gratitude was just exuberant. I'm like, oh yeah, this is you can ride, the park closes another hour and a half. You can just ride everything you want with that. And off he goes, and goes around a corner, and then that's it. And we go off, and I feel like, oh, high school kid, teenager, I did something nice for an old guy. And I think, well, that's the end of that. Only it wasn't. It stayed with me. I came away from that just never being able to forget that guy and his face. I can still see his face, but I cannot remember his voice. To this day, I cannot remember his voice. And that, I think, becomes significant when you move ahead through the years. And 11 years after this, by this time, I'm working for the FBI. It's 1992, and I'm working in Manhattan. And there's a bookstore that was walking distance to our then office, the undercover office I worked at, up in Columbus Circle, or near Columbus Circle, called the Coliseum Bookstore. I don't know if it's still there or not. But of course, they had a big section on UFOs and strange phenomena and things like that. And I was there. And I start looking at this book called The Old Straight Track. And it's about these things called ley lines, which I just knew a very little about. The ley line stuff, that's interesting. And I noticed that the author's name is Alfred Watkins. Like, okay. And he was from England. And I opened the book up, and there's a photograph of Alfred Watkins. And it's the man I met at Disneyland in 1981. I get goosebumps telling you about it now. But I got goosebumps and chills. I'm looking at this. This is the face of the man who I saw and met and talked to at Disneyland, who told me his name was Alfred. Now, I had told this story to a few people over the years before I ever learned about Alfred Watkins. But I'm looking at this, I'm going, what the heck? So I look, and I see his biography, and I'm thinking, there's no way this man died in 1935. But this is the Alfred that I met at Disneyland. And I was stunned. I started learning more about ley lines and learning how they have to do with strange phenomena. That's what I had heard about them in the late 80s, is there were a couple of guys who had done some analysis of all sorts of phenomena, UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, you name it. And what they discovered, and they did a map of this in the 80s, what they discovered was what they were calling ley lines, which I since have learned are more likely Toric Current. But some of these were at crossroads. Where these lines intersected is where there was the greatest concentration of UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, you name it, whatever strange phenomena. It seemed at the intersection of these ley lines, a lot more of this was reported. So there was, the theme of interdimensionality, in the discussion that I had learned about in the late 80s. And then here was this man who I swore was the man I encountered at Disneyland in 1981, but he had died in 1935. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, the ley lines. I'm like, no way. There's no way that this was Alfred Watkins across time and space. And it kind of blew my mind. Now, years later, after I'd learned so much more and experienced so much more weird things, because there was weird stuff that I encountered before the Disneyland incident and through the 80s, really weird phenomena stuff, and some of it associated with my uncle, the mentor I told you about. So by the time 92 rolls around, I'm neck deep into the weirdness, and it continues. So I'm jumping a lot of interesting stories, but we get to 2006, and I start really looking into this thing with Alfred and Disneyland, and I'm learning all sorts of weird things about Disneyland. But I learn about the man named C.V. Wood, Cornelius V. Wood. He was the man who worked at the legendary, infamous Stanford Research Institute, SRI, where Hal Puthoff and the RV guys and other weird science guys worked. And the Disney brothers, he had been a consultant to Walt and Roy when they went to SRI to get some data before building Disneyland. And he loved their project so much that he left SRI and went to work for the Disneys. And he was the man who was the head engineer, okay? Designing physical Disneyland. And here's what's interesting. The year that I was in the bookstore and saw the book with Alfred Watkins, 1992, was also the year that C.V. Wood died. So there's more mind-blowing synchronicity that I'm dealing with. You know, what the heck's going on here? Because this is weird things having to do with time and space. And so I thought, okay, there's something weird going on with Disneyland. And I jumped right into it, and I found all the strange things that are in the book. The symbolism, I learned that there are paranormal stories, ghosts that have been sighted by the employees and park goers, just all sorts of high strangeness, and it resulted in that book.
I mean, I absolutely know that there's like another world, a spiritual world. Like I said to you off air, like I'm a Christian. A lot of me listeners are, not all of them. Mm-hmm. And without a shadow of a doubt, there is another world which continually interacts on this one, and we see the fallout of that in the world. I mean, you're an investigator. What's your hypothesis regarding what actually happened? Because obviously you've seen him there, you've handed him the ticket, the ticket and the pin badge, so he was physical. Mm-hmm. What's your hypothesis? What happened?
In the book, I talk about 3 or 4 possibilities. One of them is all coincidence, that I just happened to meet a man who was the spitting image of this Alfred Watkins, who just happened to also be named Alfred. And all the other stuff, like seeing the book. Oh, I left out a big part. During the research on the book, the thing that really ignited it was I work with a gentleman who studies ley lines and telluric currents. And he does this by looking at topographical maps and reading the terrain, the geomorphology of the terrain. And he identified an intersection of 3 what are technically telluric currents, but we call them ley lines colloquially, energy lines, let's call them. He found an intersection of 3 of these lines located directly beneath where the carousel at Disneyland sat at the time I wrote it. So what the research in the book uncovered was, and what actually ignited going into committing to the book was, I was writing a rotating spinning device on top of an intersection of 3 of these ley lines when I saw Alfred. Okay, so back to what I think may have been going on. It was just a coincidence with a man who happened to be like a doppelganger or a double, but it was kind of a guided coincidence because I was supposed to look into this stuff about Disneyland. I was supposed to find that Watkins' book and research on ley lines was important. That's one possibility. That's one possibility. And you could say that's weird enough. The other possibility has to do with a group of people that your audience is probably more familiar with than most American audiences. At least, in the UK, and that's a group of people called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the fairy folk, the secret commonwealth. They are known to, they take on human countenance, and they are known to test the character of us mortals. And if we're generous, they really, really like that, and they bless us in some way, and off they go. Well, when you read the book and you look at all the details of the symbolism going on in that part of Disneyland and the ley lines and everything, one of the possibilities I put forth in the book is that this Alfred figure was one of the Tuatha, one of the fairy folk, taking on the visage of Alfred Watkins, who had died in 1935. And the test of my character, I apparently passed because I gave of free will my ticket, for him to go enjoy the park. And that was looked upon as a generosity on my part. And, I was blessed, I guess, with being aware of weird things, but certainly no pot of gold appeared, on my hearth. And in the book, I'm glossing over things just because of time. But in the book, I go into the details why it could have been the Tuatha Dé Danann, not the least of which is the 4 treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann are represented in Disneyland and connected with the carousel itself. So because of all that stuff, that was why there was, that possibility. And the third one is that it was a tulpa that, across time and space, my subconscious generated it on its own because, when we're in the physical, I'm in that school of thought that, we experience time in a linear moment by moment fashion, but time itself is not linear. Time, I don't even think time is circular. I think time is spherical, but that's a whole other deep discussion. But because of that, my subconscious could have conjured up Alfred because it knew that 11 years later, I would learn about Alfred Watkins and so forth and onward. And, our future touches our past and both touch the present kind of thing, which brings Hecate into the discussion. So it could have been a tulpa because of what was going on in my subconscious past, present, and the future, obviously. The fourth possibility, which for the longest time was my favorite, I lean towards the Tuatha Dé Danann thing now is probably my favorite. But for the longest time, the fourth possibility I put forth in the book is that it really was Alfred Watkins himself. And he had stepped into an intersection of one of these, of two or more of these ley lines in England back in the late 20s, right before he wrote the book. And it moved him through time and space to Disneyland. Now, there's a little details about the story that, to my mind, even don't make logical sense. Like, okay, he's moved through time and space. How would he know to buy the tickets? Well, he could ask somebody. The man spoke English, or he could have seen, back then you could buy the tickets at ticket booths and things. So, he wasn't an idiot. But that was my favorite. And those were the 4 possibilities. Either a look-alike, it's all coincidence, the fairy folk, representative of the fairy world, a tulpa, or the real guy. And so, like I said, through the years, I've wondered on each of them. I've leaned towards favorites.
It's a fascinating story, and like time, I always think about time a lot because, like you said, we live, well, it's linear for us, and it's like when I think about prophecy,
Yep.
and how, like, God, he can see everything all at once, beginning, ending, middle, everything. Nothing's future or past. And
Right.
as a finite human being, we can't wrap our heads around that because we're in time. I mean, and I've often thought about. I mean, we all love Back to the Future, right? We all wish we could go 88 miles an hour and go back or go whatever. But like even one slight change to anything, if you was to go, say, back, could have massive implications. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, it's just fascinating. I'm listening to you there, and like you, one of the things that stands out to me, you're not saying this is what happened. You've got a variety of hypotheses, which,
Yeah.
because let's face it, on a lot of things we can't be certain.
Right.
People like to be dogmatic about certain things, and in reality, what do we actually know, really?
Right. Right.
We
Yeah.
know.
It's because I honestly I don't know. The things that I do know that I'm confident on, I'll tell you, yeah, this happened and it happened that way, and that's what it was. But I learned in my profession, um, there's two things that that I learned in my operational world where your lives depend upon people being honest and straight with you. I don't like a narcissist, and I don't like a guy who acts like he knows when he doesn't. Okay, because in the world I was in for 20 years, that can get you killed, and not trusted by your colleagues. It's a better man who admits when he doesn't know something, and to me, that's just that's my nature. That's the way I am. So, if there's multiple possibilities, and even one or two among them are ones that aren't as fun or ones that I disagree with, I'm still going to include those because they could be true. And
Mm,
honestly, that's where being a professional investigator really influences, if you're an honest one, and you did it right or try to do it right. um your job is not to decide what was what happened. Your job is to find what did happen, what the evidence is, and to present it, so that it can be analyzed and maybe it can be determined what happened. So you have to be honest with yourself, um, in being honest with others. And in this community, it's a lot of fun to get attention. There's people out there that have a lot of fun saying wild stories and they
yeah.
get the attention, but all too often we end up finding out that they were making that stuff up. And it's just too bad to see people get strung along. So for me, my mind, my conscience, ever since I was a kid, I go with the truth, and I
Mm.
go with honesty. And hey, I think it's just as fun to have multiple possibilities of weirdness to consider, right? I mean,
Yeah.
any one of those, even just a look-alike, why that look-alike? Well,
Yeah.
11 years later, when I see the book, so that makes even just a look-alike part of the weird fun.
Yeah.
So it's all, to me, it's all just as good being honest as it is, you know, being
I,
otherwise.
I, I totally agree with you because one of the things I've noticed since doing this, I mean, for me, this isn't my living. I don't need to come on here and have wild stories that everyone's gonna like, and because it's gonna make me money. I'm not interested in that. I like to talk to people, and
Hmm.
I want to get to the truth. That's important. But
Hmm.
sometimes we don't know what the truth is, and
Yeah.
we can have possibilities, and we can have a look at it. And sometimes I go away from here. Sometimes a guest has said something, and I think about it, and then I think, nah, or then I might think, yeah, I can see what they're saying, and but we have got to be honest, and there is too many people out there that are just saying things to get views,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's not what I'm about on here. I mean, obviously, Pete, I like to get guests on who have interesting stories, but one of the things that stood out, I knew you weren't saying this is what it is, and that's what I liked that you had. You said you didn't really know, but you sort of lean towards one thing and maybe over time you've changed. And I think that's important. And like you said, admitting when you don't know, I don't have a problem with it, me. I can say about a lot of things listen, I just don't know. And that's fine. That's being honest. And like, I'm with you on that when people are being dogmatic about certain things and you think you can't be dogmatic about this or whatever you're saying.
Yeah.
And I just think that a lot of these guys who are doing this for a living, they're under pressure to get views because they're relying on it. And that's not a healthy position to be in as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, I do. This is the publishing is what I do for a living. And I speak at events and I write the books and I sell the books. But I know that I could get a lot more attention. I could get a lot more spotlight on bigger stages. And if I made stuff up or if I said, this is the way it is, this is what happened. So, on the one hand, some people would say, all these years you've been around, you're kind of shorting yourself. And I said, no, in the long run, it's always better to be, have the longevity, being the honest person, than making stuff up. Because think about it, the people who make stuff up, and we've had some examples of that in recent years, they burn out. They burn out because their lies catch up to them, and they can't keep their stories up, and it does a disservice to discussions about these things. Because your audience, you and me, we're people who, to varying degrees, having and I think every human being encounters something strange at some point in their lives, and we're just honest people. We find this interesting. We're trying to get a handle on it. We're trying to learn more about it and understand it. And when these guys come along with these wild stories just to get attention, and they drag with them a bunch of the audience who want to believe in it, it does the community a disservice, because when they're proven to essentially be dishonest, to be liars, it kind of paints the community or others, or at least we get splashed with the paint of their misdeeds to outsiders. Outsiders say, oh, well, those people make that stuff up all the time, all of them are lying, and that's not the case. It's a weird world, and my personal view is we live the mortal existence we live in our place on the spectrum where we're at for a reason. There's a reason that we're having this conversation and saying, hey, I'm not sure, I don't know. And I catch hell for this all the time. I say, well, it has to do with faith. And they immediately think I'm talking religion. And I'm like, well, religion is part of that discussion, obviously, but human faith, part of our experience here is to learn how that works. Not a blind faith, not a foolish faith, but encountering just enough of the corner of our eye weirdness to know and sense, yeah, there's something else and beyond this physical mortal existence, but some of it's not for us yet in this particular part of the spectrum. And there's a reason for that. And I think it's very simple. We're supposed to, it's the age old thing. We're supposed to appreciate each other, and help each other, that kind of thing. And the wild, amazing, magical stuff will come. I think, obviously, right now, I like to think this, these things we're talking about and all the questions we have, I like to think that, well, after we die, we learn all that stuff. It's like, oh, there are ETs, or oh, there are ghosts, or oh, there is this, there is that. Okay. But, while we're here, maybe we're supposed to be focusing on paying attention to why we're here and what we're doing here. May not be as fun, but it is ultimately rewarding. That said, here I am still talking about what the heck happened to me at Disneyland and what are the possibilities. And I'm still fascinated with the otherworldly. But I always remind people, because I've experienced this, it's a two-sided coin. It's a double-edged blade. With all the fun, there's the dark part, there's the part with teeth that can bite you. And whatever your personal tradition is, whatever, whatever a person's spiritual faith is, I think that thing is something that they all share. There is dark, there is light,
Yeah.
there you got to be careful with it. Christopher Lee, the actor, you can find this on YouTube. It's out there, an interview with him. The interviewer said, "Hey, you have a reputation for having an amazing occult library." And he answered really intelligently. He said, "Yeah, I goes, I don't, it's not as big as some people think it is, but yes, I do have some occult books." But he warned, he said, "That does not make me an occultist." He goes, "I'm a student, a scholar," essentially is what he said. And he goes, "You have to be very, very careful with that stuff, because if you're not, that way lies madness." And I think too many people see some of these things as toys to play with. So, and anyway, that goes into just what our experience here is supposed to be. I don't know. I could be wrong.
I mean, you're right. I mean, I have particular beliefs. Like, I'm not going into them right now. We haven't got the time. I'm sure you probably know some of the things I believe anyway, and my audience will. But you're absolutely right. There is darkness and there is light. And I mean, some of my guests are Christians, some of them aren't. And then the ones that aren't, I've heard them talk about things. And I think you actually have no idea about the darkness, because if you did, you wouldn't be talking like you do. Because the thing is with the darkness, the evil powers, it's so deceptive.
Yeah.
And the Bible talks about Satan, and it says that he was more subtle. And this is the thing, because he doesn't turn up, he isn't coloured red with horns. That's not how he looks.
Yeah.
In fact, he's probably, if he did show up, probably the most beautiful thing you have ever seen, because it says he masquerades as an angel of light.
Yeah.
And he's so subtle, and his sleight of hand is undetectable almost. And a lot of the things that he'll say, he'll whisper to us. He's so close to the truth, but it's not the truth. So you get a lot of people, like you said there, Christopher Lee, he had the library and he was saying, basically be careful with this stuff. Like, there's a reason why we shouldn't delve into that stuff, because we are not in control. We're not a body that has a soul. We are a soul that has a body.
I like that. Yeah, I agree with
this.
that.
This is just temporary. This is our,
exactly,
as the Bible calls it, a tabernacle. This is just where we're dwelling right now, and we're in time and space. But you're absolutely right in the fact that there is lightness, there is dark. Obviously, we can debate with people of different faiths or whatever, but we're not doing that. That's not what this is about. That's not what this episode's about. I mean, that I'm going to be thinking about your hypothesis on this situation with this Alfred Watkins. Because it will go over and over in my mind for a while, this, which is good, because I like things to think about when I'm in work and whatever, and this will be one of them. But I read a quote online by a guy called John Bruno Hare, and he wrote this on. I don't know who the guy is, but I was just reading into Alfred Watkins, looking into him a little bit. Like, he was born in Hereford and everything in England. I'm familiar with that place. But this is what he said about Watkins. He said that Watkins never attributed any supernatural significance to lays, and he believed that there were simply pathways that had been used for trade or ceremonial purposes. Very ancient in origin, possibly dating back to Neolithic, certainly pre-Roman. He was an intensely rational person with an active intellect, and I think he would be a bit disappointed with some of the fringe aspects of ley lines today. Now, obviously, I mean, there are those in the wider archaeological community who sort of, well, they call it pseudo-archaeology, don't they, relating to ley lines.
Yeah.
But, I mean, just sort of before we go, I have a basic understanding of ley lines, and you mentioned Toric Current. Could you just sort of explain a little bit more about ley lines, what they are, and what telluric current is, whether it's different or?
Yeah. The simple way to think of it is ley lines are something created by man. Okay.
Mm.
It's the paths that connect, sacred places, ancient temples in some cases. And, but telluric current is this extreme low frequency that is part of the formation of a planet, in our case, Earth. Back when, it's in that volcanic era and everything's forming, the telluric current, this energy is running through all of this while it's forming, and it helps form the terrain. Now, once everything solidifies and settles down and cools, the telluric current is still there and it flows through the terrain that it helps shape. Because, as we know, there's natural electromagnetic energy running through the planet. Okay. So telluric current can run in, according to geomorphologists that I've talked to, and a gentleman I work with named Seshari, it can run through curvilinear, as he puts it, which follows the flow of like riverbeds and canyons and things like that. Or it can also flow in what's called the main or major straight line, which think of what we attribute to the works of Nikola Tesla, that kind of grid, of the planet, and this energy flows through all of that. But it is a scientifically recognized reality. For instance, at least here in the US, when our railroads were being built in the 19th century, telegraphy, the old Western Union Morse code, telegraph, these were owned by the railroad companies, right? And as they built the railroad, the telegraph lines were, set as they went. Well, telegraphers, they know about telluric current. This is a real thing. And so because it enhances the use of the telegraphic technology, they laid the rail lines along telluric current paths. So in the United States, you can follow telluric current often because the railroad runs like right on it or right parallel to it, because the telegraphers were telling them, run the track this way for X number of miles, because we know that, and then as we got into the 20th century, here, at least here in the US Navy started using what was called ground radio, which was very similar to Tesla technology. And they would literally put a spike in the earth and it would enhance the radio operations that they would use. And so this again, and then when radio, actual, on your dial, listen to radio, when they would build radio stations and radio towers, many of these are built along telluric current paths because enhances that technology also. Airports, because the operations at airports, even hospitals, because this stuff has been found to enhance healing and things like it's wild, and it's a real thing, telluric current. So if all these industries and technologies find this kind of benefit, we have to ask ourselves, what extraordinary properties might it have? Who knows? So really, what I found in my research, and really for years digging into this, when people say weird things going on with the ley lines or at the intersections of ley lines, what they don't understand is they've just been using the wrong term. What they really mean is this telluric current, because the map I told you about the guys did in the 80s, what that really is the intersections of this telluric current. That's where weird things have been reported, measured, and are going on, according to the reports and the witnesses that can be trusted, to the extent that their character backs up our ability to trust what they say. And that's really it comes down to, I had this moment in 2010 where I had another weird experience, but that was the moment in my life where I quit caring if anyone else believed me that I was having weird experiences. I had an epiphany, and I'm like, It doesn't matter whether other people believe me. It doesn't matter whether they see it or not. It truly doesn't matter because my experiences are for me. It doesn't mean I'm the only guy out there. That's the other thing we have in our community. We have these guys that want to set themselves up as prophets, and I'm the only one who can see this. No, 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 no. I'm egalitarian about this. I always have been. Any one of us can have these experiences. Any one of us can see these things. What I'm saying is, what you see and experience is really intended for you, the individual, because you're supposed to get something out of it. And that's going back to when I said faith. I don't mean faith as in this particular religion or that particular religion. What I mean is faith, with the small f, you as a human being being given a clue or a hint or a touch to know that or understand that there is something beyond this. But it can't come right out and say, okay, yeah, there is something beyond this, because we're supposed to experience this as we are. We're supposed to, whether it's go through struggles, go through joys, but it really is all about, you as the individual, and your experiences. You don't need to convince the crowd, just get out of them what you're supposed to get out of them. And I've been that way for the last 14 years. I'll share them. I'll talk about them when asked. Certainly, if I feel compelled to write about it for some reason, I'll write about it. But I really, whether someone believes me or not, and I have people disagree with my interpretation. It does not change the experience for me at all, because they didn't have my experience exactly with me. They weren't there. So it's that's really the best way.
The ley lines thing is like I don't even know how this come about, but when I was looking into, I did an episode on Jimmy Savile. I don't know if you know who Jimmy Savile is or was. Yeah. So I did a research into Jimmy Savile, and one of the things that I found out, which was really strange, was that the BBC, the sort of headquarters, if you like, is on an intersection of multiple ley lines. Multiple. And there's a lot of weird and dark stuff went on in the BBC, even stuff probably now that, well, there's definitely been other stuff gone on. And there's speculation at the minute over here of certain celebrities that are going to be probably, when they're dead, named as being on the level of Jimmy Savile. There's an investigator who's looked into Jimmy Savile case a while back who has come out and said that there is another, in his words, untouchable out there who will be exposed when they die. And this BBC thing, and when I read that, I was like, wonder what that's all about. But apparently this intersection at the BBC, it's almost like a mandala. It says there's multiple intersections of ley lines. Well, what I call ley lines. That's what the articles and the research, when I looked in, that's what it said. So who knows? I mean, I just thought, because Jimmy Savile himself was into dark magic. He had an altar and everything at home. He must have been a Freemason, because Freemasons attended his funeral and all that type of stuff. But who knows? It was just, I never expected that to come up in my research, and I was surprised by it. But there you go. I can't say why that's the case and whether that has any bearing upon what's been going on at the BBC for years. I have no idea. It's just a little nugget there.
From my perspective, that's something I didn't know. From my perspective, it's like, okay, I shouldn't be surprised, because just from where I'm coming from, with what I've found in research, what I've experienced, some really dark things are done. I've written this trilogy of books years ago. It was the stuff I wrote right after the Disneyland book, Empire of the Wheel. And in that, I lay out the first book. I have a co-author, a guy named Rick Spence, fantastic researcher. And we lay out in the first book that this series of murders were committed at the intersections of these telluric currents. In a chapter in that book, we were the first people, as far as I know, first writers to at least put out there that there is a connection to all 7 of the Zodiac killer murder victims. And that is the fact that they were all assaulted on telluric currents or intersections of telluric currents. And that's in the book. That's laid out. And I have these maps that this gentleman I told you about that does these for me. He did a map for me 2 years before I did my analysis on the Zodiac killer murder sites, and it was shocking. I went and pinpointed them on one map, and then I went to the map he made of the telluric currents and their intersections. And when it was a match, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it was. I remember that night. It was a shock. It's like, oh my God, something just like in 1915, these murders I wrote about, 50 years later or so, the Zodiac killer is doing the same thing. Are there any others? And I did find others. And so, yeah, terrible, terrible things. It doesn't surprise me because in my own research, I found where terrible things are done. Telluric current and these telluric lines and ley lines, they're like electricity. Well, they are in a low frequency electricity, but what I'm saying is in their nature is this. Electricity does wonderful things, right? It lights our world. It gives us cell phones. It gives us great medical technology, all this great technology, this sci-fi world we live in. It does all these positive things, but it can also kill you if it's mishandled, right? Yes. It can kill you. And that's the way this telluric current, whatever this other thing running through this is, if you're not careful with it, it can kill you. It can bite, as well as benefit. And so it never surprises me. It all depends on what the person is doing on the current, right? You can do a really good thing like build a great amusement park, and right where everything intersects, you can put a carousel. And what does that do? That draws up and spreads out the energy for a positive experience, which is what C.V. Wood was doing with Disneyland. Or you can commit heinous crimes, on other human beings, including murder. And it can spike an area with a negative energy. And this does have to do with, dark ritualistic magic. There's a whole other conversation. I generally keep enthusiasts of that at arm's length.
Definitely. When you were talking before as well, you mentioned the railway there, and you said obviously it's the same over here. I actually work on the railway, so as soon as you mentioned that, and you was mentioning the telegraph poles, we had it the same. And you said that they were put on these on telluric current ley lines.
Yeah, they follow the telluric current. It's kind of, when you first see it and learn about it, it's astonishing. You're like,
yeah.
Oh, they knew about this. This was the old West, out here. Yeah. And I was like, wow, they knew about this. And they built it's really, it's really eye-opening and fascinating. You have these images of this diabolical steampunk technology, back then. But yeah, it's a fact.
When you mentioned it, and then I thought about that with the BBC, I started to think about the amount of suicides that actually happen on the railway. And because I work on the railway, I've obviously noticed it, and I often thought to myself, it must be few and far between that it happens. Now, I remember a number of years ago, before when I lived in England, I actually moved to Wales. That's where we live now. But when we lived back home in England, I remember having to pick my wife up one night because she took my son to Manchester, and she was on the way home on the train. And the reason the train got cancelled is someone jumped in front of the train off a bridge and killed themselves. And because I used to ride trains, but not all the time. But now that I work on it, it's not until you sort of work there, you realize how frequent it is. So when you was talking before, and then I thought about the Jimmy Savile thing, and then you were saying like murders have took place at these places. I wonder if that has any bearing on why there's so many suicides on railways. It's never
They
something I've thought about. I didn't know.
they might, yeah, for some it could be that they're drawn to it.
Yeah,
My gosh, when I think of there are so many less painful ways
I know
to do that,
that's what I
right?
mean.
Jumping in front
Yeah.
of a big,
Mm.
huge speeding hunk of steel. Oh my, yeah, I know it's over pretty quickly, but there's still that, those
Yeah,
moments. Not,
there's easier ways, like, so I
yeah,
wonder if that does have any bearing. Do you know what I mean?
yeah. It's that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of
Mm.
that. I didn't know that stat, but I don't know.
It's
That's
weird.
really interesting. I wonder, the thing to do would be if there have been any survivors of an attempt, and if you could get them to talk and ask them,
Mm.
why did you think of doing it that way? And you might get 9 times out of 10, well, I just figured it would be quick, but you might get that one that kind of had a story leading up to what led
Yeah.
them. And what comes to my mind is that old story of the devil at the crossroads. um is there something that lures the vulnerable? Is it, well, I wonder how many of them actually thought it out, or if it was a sudden, they become overwhelmed with what's
Mm.
troubling them, and they just do it. And then my weird mind goes to, okay, did they just become overwhelmed, or did something give them a psycho-emotional nudge?
Mm.
Which there are things, on that farther out in the spectrum that would absolutely play with us in that way.
Yeah,
They don't like us, and they would play with us and destroy us for their own
definitely.
amusement. So, you have to ask that, or I don't know. That's wow.
Mm.
See, that opens up a whole discussion.
It does. Well, before we just carry on and on and on, because we could do,
Yeah.
we're going to draw this one to a close because
Okay.
I've got other things wrote down that I wanted to talk to you about, but I'm limited
Okay.
for time, and I think it'd do a disservice to just skip over certain things. So
Okay.
I'd like to do another episode on
Absolutely.
other stuff that I've got wrote down. So before we wrap this up, Walter, could you tell people where they can find you and where they can get your books and everything?
Well, the best place to go is where they're at, and that's walterbosley.com. I keep it simple, walterbosley.com. And also, if you want to see me talk about stuff, and uh, I'm at the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube. Um, so yeah, those are the best places to find me.
Great,
And
thanks, Walter. It's been
thank
a
you, Paul.
fascinating. It's been fascinating talking to you. So guys, mind-blowing stuff again. I know that my regular listeners are not strangers to some of this wild stuff that we talk about, but like Walter said, he has various hypotheses. It's good sometimes just to say, listen, I don't know, and we don't know a lot of stuff, and I've said that previously. So thanks again, Walter.
Thank you.
I'm going to be back next week, guys, with a new guest, hopefully next week. So I'm Paul, and this is Beyond the Paradigm.